Hi, welcome to our debate. Our group focused on the use of restrictions and the ethical considerations for use of restrictions on individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities. In our group, we have Melanie, Jessica, April, Jana, and Chelsea. So I'm just going to roll right in. ABA is the applied science of modification to an individual's behavior. These behaviors are specific to the improvement of one's functioning within society. The world of ABA is fairly new, and with that comes many different questions as to what's helpful and what can be improved upon throughout that world. Behavior analysts must adhere to the rules and regulations created within what we call the Board Certified Behavior Compliance Codes. These codes were created to ensure that all individuals will follow a consistent service plan for individuals with severe aggression towards themselves or others. Individuals with autism or other developmental disabilities who engage in these severe behaviors, they pose significant threats to themselves, peers, staff, teachers, and parents who work with them on a day-to-day basis. Ethical codes promote the use of least restrictive procedures. However, these providing services to individuals with severe problem behaviors may consider to use the use of restraints or seclusion, as long as they state that these are necessary to prevent self-harm or harm to others. We used we found in an article, Functional Behavioral Assessments, Legal Requirements and Challenges. The authors found that the U.S. Department of Education stated the needs of the individual child is the most important in deciding on the most appropriate form of inclusion or restriction on behavior intervention. This information should be selected based on the data that was collected from interviews and behavior assessments. And that's also authors also noted that through the IDA, which is the Individuals with Disability Education Act, if there is a behavior a student is exhibiting and that is able to be anticipated, continuously happening, or disturbs his or others' learning, then the IEP must focus on that behavior. After the IEP is created, the behavior analyst must provide the IEP team with measurable goals as well as environmental components of the behavior. Through a website called Association for Behavior Analysis International, ABAI, behavior analysts must specify the reasoning for the use of restraint or seclusions. It must use reinforcement throughout the process, corresponding to a functional behavior assessment that was done, as well as be reliable by researched literature. A functional behavior assessment is the use of direct and indirect interviews and assessments to assess the direct reasoning behind an occurrence of a specific behavior. There must be a crisis management plan put into place that involves steps to take during the behavior, such as the situation, as well as any providing instances and other techniques entailed first have failed. Risks should be considered and the environment should be set up to be able to deal with the matter appropriately and safely. A physical restrictive hold should only be considered if the individual is aggressive and dangerous enough to cause harm to others. A medical professional must review and sign the BIP, which is a behavior interventional plan, in order to legally implement a physical restrictive hold on an individual. The behavior analyst then must also receive consent from parents and guardians, as well as have an informed plan on how they will monitor the behavior plan to ensure that it is being followed correctly. Now we'll hear from Chelsea on some definitions of restraint and seclusion.
Okay, so we have included two official definitions of physical restraint and seclusion to be used for reference in the following debate. These definitions were agreed upon by a task force selected by the Executive Council of the Association for Behavior Analysis International in 2010. quote, restraint involves physically holding or securing the individual either A, for a brief period of time to interrupt and intervene with severe problem behavior, or B, for an extended period of time using mechanical devices to prevent otherwise uncontrollable problem behavior. An example given is self-injurious that has the potential to produce serious injury. When used in the context of a behavior intervention plan, restraint in some cases serves both a protective and a therapeutic function. These procedures can reduce risks of injury and can facilitate learning opportunities that support appropriate behavior. Seclusion involves isolating an individual from others to interrupt and intervene with problem behavior that places the individual or others at risk of harm. When used in the context of a behavior intervention plan, seclusion in some cases serves both a protective and a therapeutic function. These procedures can reduce risks of injury and can facilitate learning opportunities that support appropriate behavior. ABAI is opposed to the use of seclusion when it is operationally defined as placing someone in a locked room, often combined with the use of mechanical restraint or sedation, and not part of a formal behavior intervention plan to which the individual has served or his or her guardian has consented. We support the use of a planned timeout treatment or safety intervention that conforms to evidence-based research as part of a comprehensive treatment or safety plan that meets the standards of information consent, of informed consent by the individual served or his or her legal guardian, and is evaluated on an ongoing basis via the use of contemporaneously collected objective data, unquote.
Okay, and now we're going to get into the debate. We're going to hear from a con side.
The Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysis has several different codes of ethics listed as harmful and intrusive. 410 states avoiding harmful reinforcers. At times during restraints, it does come out that the restraint itself is reinforcing. Using a restraint as an increase in problem behaviors goes against the ethical code of using harmful reinforcers. Code 3.01, Behavior Analytic Assessment. Before any restraint should be completed, an assessment needs to be done, and before any restraint is implemented. 4.02, involving clients in planning and consent. We always need to involve clients in planning and consent during restraints. Most clients would likely not consent if they were asked if they wanted to be restrained by somebody. And finally, 4.09 of the code talks about least restrictive procedures, and a restraint and seclusion is not least restrictive.
Okay, thank you, Jess. We're going to go into a thought from Jana.
There are many different versions of physical restraint. All the different forms are able to change as the behavior changes. As stated, the definition of physical restraint is broad. It is any physical holding or securing of a person. That definition allows for many different forms of restraint. A physical restraint could be placing a hand in front of a child to block them from running into the street. Physical restraint would be needed in this instance, just like it is in the intervention plan. Physical restraint can go from the least restrictive into a more restrictive plan, depending on what the individual's behavior warrants. A hand placed on a child holding them in place from going into the street would be on the least restrictive side. Physical restraint escalates as the behavior escalates. As stated by the article, the physical restraint of children is it therapeutic. Physical restraint is employed in a dangerous situations after least intrusive approaches have been proven as ineffective. The form of physical restraint and the intensity of it is regulated by state law and in institutions also provide training to make sure that going into the restraints know how to properly execute them. If the restraints are going from least restrictive to most restrictive, the staff needs to have a clear understanding of how that will play out. Training can be useful in these situations. Those needing training could carry out situations that they see every day. Working through different situations with other people will help those implementing restraints to see how a situation that they encounter could be resolved properly. With the increase of difficult behaviors, the need for physical restraint in a least restrictive environment is increasing. Physical restraint, no matter how intrusive, deters reinforcing of aggressive behaviors. Another form of physical restraint listed in the article stated before is containment. The use of containment provides an external control to a child whose internal controls are not functioning properly. They are overwhelmed by their surroundings and need an outlet.
Okay, for the opposing side, we're going to hear from Chelsea.
So restraint has been the culprit of at least 65 deaths, according to the National Review of Restraint-Related Deaths of Children and Adults with Disabilities in 2011. Of those individuals, 75% had some comorbid psychiatric disorder such as schizophrenia, while 25% had an intellectual or developmental disability. Half of these instances in which individuals exhibited aggressive behavior did not meet legal standards that would have required restraint to be used at all. From this information, we can deduce that possibly many unwarranted uses of restraint occur yearly at the very least. And when those occurrences end in the death of an individual, that's simply unacceptable.
For myself, restrictions may be needed through the use of hand blocks or needed to decrease the amount of access to self-stimulatory behaviors that may be hindering an individual's learning. I found in an article titled Training an Autistic Client, the Effect of Brief Restraint on Disruptive Behaviors. Author Philip Tomporowski used the use of physical restraint on a 13-year-old female who was diagnosed with autism. She engaged in self-stimulatory behaviors. These behaviors include such as withdrawing from the teacher, bringing her legs to her chest, hand flapping and tensing of her body. There were two trainers that were necessary for the restraint process. One staff member used verbal and physical prompting, and a second staff member would apply the physical restraint, which immobilized her arms and legs for no more than 60 seconds. Appropriate behavior was rewarded when the individual engaged in such behaviors, and a fading protocol was then followed. The results showed an increase of on-task behaviors and response rate from the client, as well as continuous decrease in the 3 previously noted disruptive behaviors. The use of the faded physical restraint in this specific study showed significant improvements in on-task behaviors and a decrease in self-stimulatory behaviors as well. We're going to hear from an opposing idea from Jeff. Jess, you're muted.
Shoot. Who are we trying to treat? So who are we trying to treat? The staff or the client when it comes to restraints and seclusion? If we're trying to treat the staff, we are not following the Code of Ethics. Again, the Code of Ethics 1.02 states that we should only be treating clients in our boundaries of competence, and 1.01 suggests that we need to use scientific knowledge. There are more rules. According to the Code of Ethics, we should do no harm to clients. We should be respecting the clients. We should be being just. We should be treating the clients as we personally want to be treated, being faithful, according dignity, and accepting accountability.
All right, April.
Okay, so restraints protect individuals, whether it be a child, a teenager, or an adult, and staff and others from severe aggression or self-injurious behavior. In a research article, choosing staff members reduces time in mechanical restraint due to self-injurious behavior and requesting restraint. Research found that when an individual was able to choose the person who would restrain them, the amount of restraints and the time in the restraint was decreased. So a little background of the study was that using mechanical restraints to protect a person who engaged in dangerous self-injurious behavior was decreased by manipulation of an establishing operation involving the client choosing the staff person who would work with her. So in this study, the participant was a 20-year-old woman named Carol, and she was diagnosed with autism when she was 4 years old. So during her childhood, she struggled with irregular sleep patterns, and she didn't respond appropriately to painful stimuli such as hot water. So at the time of the study, when she was 28, she had been diagnosed with autism, bipolar disorder, moderate intellectual disability, hypotonia, and musculoskeletal deformities. She lived in a state-operated residential center for individuals with developmental disabilities. She lived in a duplex with 15 other residents and had her own bedroom and living space. So Carol had a history of self-injurious behavior that included biting herself, and these bites were so severe that they caused irreversible nerve damage. She also had frequent episodes of aggression, mostly when she was asked to perform an undesired task, and property destruction. So during these episodes, she would hit staff, kick property, and try to break restraints to bite herself. In the study, the mechanical restraints were applied when she bit, when she tried to bite, or when she would ask for them to be applied. When the episodes occurred, at least 2 staff members were required to restrain her. So the restraints used in this study were mechanical restraints called EMTs, motion trainers, and these prevented her from bending her elbow. And these were applied to each arm after she began biting, when she attempted to bite, or when she asked for them to put on. And they were also left on until she asked to have them removed. And she also wore cotton gloves 24/7, visors, except for when she was in the shower. So this study was conducted alternating treatment design, where she could choose a staff person who would work with her on some days but not on other days. And it was conducted in 3 phases. So in phase one was no choice. It was a 30-day baseline, and the staff person who worked with her was selected by the unit manager. And they were selected in a pool from 4 to 8 members. In phase 2, it was alternating choice and no choice. So in this phase, Carol, for half of the time, Carol was able to choose who restrained her, and the other half of the time, it was the unit manager who chose who would restrain her. So, and during this phase, she was also given 3 choices. So who's your first choice, who's your second choice, who's your third choice. And the choice and no choice were irregularly alternated so that no more than 3 sessions were identical. And in phase 3, she chose which staff member restrained her every day for 19 days. In this study, there was also 100% inter-observer agreement to the study that when she was allowed to choose a staff member, the use of mechanical restraint was decreased. So being able to make that choice was associated with a significant reduction in the time spent in the mechanical restraint. So providing Carol with a choice staff member was associated with a 50% reduction in the time in the restraint, which makes this a very efficient procedure that helps to protect the individual and the individuals who work with them in order to keep them safe.
Awesome. Now we're going to hear an opposing idea from Jess.
Okay. The use of physical restraints is problematic when the function of the behavior is not identified. In the article, the detrimental effects of physical restraints as a consequence for inappropriate classroom behavior, Maggie and Ellis discussed needing to figure out the function of the behavior. So the 4 functions of behavior are escape, attention, access to tangible, and self-stimulatory behavior. And if we were to use restraints and seclusion on some of them functions, we're essentially giving the client what they want, and their aggressions will increase. Physical restraints alone are not going to decrease any problematic behavior. The researchers Dishion and Andrews in the article Preventing Escalation and Problem Behaviors with High-Risk Young Adolescents, immediate and 1-year outcomes found that students or individuals who were intervened with the restrictive of seclusion setting engaged in more severe or more frequent problem behaviors following the intervention.
Okay, in April.
Okay, so although aggressive behaviors represent a major obstacle to the successful treatment and education of individuals with autism, ABA offers scientifically validated methods of overcoming it. So using these methods in combination with restraints work to decrease problem behavior and provide opportunities to teach more appropriate behaviors. So in the study of the long-term successful treatment of the aggressive and destructive behaviors of a pre-adolescent with autism, researchers found restraints were combined with other ends. The aggressive and destructive behaviors were reduced to 0 or near 0 levels. So in this study, the participant was a 13-year-old boy. His name was Johnny, and he had been diagnosed with autism and disruptive behavior not otherwise specified. So he lived at home with his parents and his older sister. He was mainly echoic and used one-word requests to obtain items. So the main behavioral concerns for Johnny were aggression. His aggression began at an early age and escalated in frequency and intensity over time. His aggression included hitting, kicking, punching, pinching, biting, and headbutting, which caused serious harm to the individuals who worked with him. And his other behaviors included destructive behavior, breaking and throwing items. So his behavior was so severe that he frequently injured multiple people, such as teachers, causing them bloody noses. And some teachers reported even wearing shin guards to protect themselves from his kicks. And he would break classroom materials and objects in his home, such as throwing desks and destroying his bedroom. So at the time of the study, Johnny was in a self-contained classroom in a public school with 3 peers and several staff members. There was little teaching. Little teaching was possible due to his behavior, and most of the tasks that were given to him were too easy in order to prevent him from acting out. So the previous interventions that had been tried separately in this study and were ineffective included extinction, timeout, restraint, token economy, and DRO. So Johnny's aggression and lack of progress were major concerns, and he was being considered for placement in a residential school. So at this time, BCBA was called, and a program was designed that targeted his aggression and destructive behavior. So a functional assessment was done to identify the function of the behavior, which was escape, and baseline data was collected for 3 months. So the baseline data was collected by all staff members in the classroom, and the entire school day was divided into 5-minute segments. An event recording was also used continuously. So the intervention program consisted of a token economy, differential reinforcement of other behaviors, a response cost, overcorrection, and physical restraint. Visuals for also used. So with all the interventions, such as a token economy was used, he had to receive 5 tokens. Once the behavior started to improve, his reinforcement items cost a little more, and he earned a token every time he responded appropriately to a teacher instructions and behaved well. So when he received all his tokens, he was given 5 to 10 minutes with his choice of reinforcer, and this tokenomics was only in effect during one-on-one instruction. And each 5-minute will no aggressive and destructive behavior was reinforced with 1 token. And this was used separate from the other program, the previous program of the token. So in the program, once he received 5 tokens, he could exchange them for a highly reinforcing activity. It was Response cost, when he emitted a target behavior, 1 token from the token economy and the DRO schedule was removed. If the target behavior occurred during a reinforcing activity was removed and he was required to begin working again. Overcorrection, 2 forms of overcorrection were used. Restitution corrected. So whenever he threw any objects in the room, like for example, he threw a chair, he was required to straighten the chair and fix all chairs in the room. Practice overcorrection was used, implement for inappropriate behavior. If he made a loud noise in the hallway, he was required to practice walking down the hallway multiple times. Physical restraint, crisis intervention, was implemented whenever his aggressive or destructive behavior had escalated to a point where he posed a danger to himself or others. During this procedure, he was placed on a mat with 1 person restraining each arm and 1 person restraining his legs. No one spoke to him, and he stayed in the restraint until he was calm. The results of this study were that when all the interventions were used in combination, his aggressive and destructive behaviors dramatically increased. So in baseline, it was reported that 102 incidents per day of aggressive and destructive behavior. By the end of the first month, it had decreased by 95% with only 5 incidents per day. So by the 6th month, it had decreased to 0.29 incidents per day at a near zero level. So his behaviors were successfully and quickly treated, and his success has so far been maintained for 1 year, and he's made excellent educational progress.
Thanks, April. Now we're going to hear from Chelsea and some medical issues.
Okay, so medical issues such as adrenal rush in an escalating situation and the possibility of physical trauma to client or staff are of great concern. Many times medical history is not considered, or it's completely unknown to the staff who actually employ these methods. Conditions such as morbid obesity, epilepsy, respiratory issues, and other issues play a critical role in the decision to use physical restraint. According to the comprehensive review mentioned earlier, more than half of the 65 individuals who died in physical restraints were morbidly obese. This was a study done by Norwood and the rest in 2011. Morbidly obese persons subdued in physical restraints, such as a prone hold, are at risk of dying from asphyxiation. So included in this presentation is a visual that demonstrates a prone hold, which is a common physical restraint. And when used incorrectly or without considering medical history, it can be and has proved fatal. Other incorrect usages include too many people engaging in restraining an individual at one time, excessive force to the back or neck, pressing the upper body into surfaces, causing suffocation, and others.
Thank you, Chelsea. We are now going to hear from Jana.
Training could mean the difference between the proper implementation when necessary to physical restraint. More often than not, the stories that are shown on the news are the work of improper use of the restraints. Stories that often are the results of the schools not having permission to use restraints. They have never been trained in the proper use of them, and the situation could be remedied through a much less intrusive procedure. Crisis Prevention Institute is a program to train staff in nonviolent crisis intervention. Not only does CPI train for the use of restraints, it trains for the Dishion without restraint. According to Crisis Prevention, CPI, 73% of behavioral facilities gave those in position to use restraints one area, and when the situation can be reduced through other interventions. The training takes place every 6 months by a trainer Workbooks you show and test individuals on the different forms of prevention. So shows like the different forms of restraints that you can use as well. It also being forward, practicing the different moves and forms of restraint individual for the real. Proper use of restraint means the difference between someone getting hurt and a de-escalated situation. Melanie, your mic.
In conclusion, the use of physical restraints sparks debate today. Behaviors that warrant these interventions are severe enough that the least restrictive procedures have failed to change them. It is the responsibility of the behavior analyst to know the ethical guidelines and to know the dangers of using such invasive procedures. Knowing both of these factors will lead professionals through the difficult decisions of using or not using physical restraints or seclusions when it comes to behavior that are problematic, that affect students, staff, and other individuals that are involved in that process. One of the first questions was, you mentioned the lack of training that is a potential for those who perform restraint. Are there any strategies or methods that can help improve training for administering restraints and or decrease the need for restraint? Does anybody want to go into that one?
I can. As stated in my pro, CPI training is a method of training that, if done properly, gives new and updated training to those using restraints. The training has a workbook to go through, and you are tested at the end. The workbook shows different scenarios as to which trainings would, or which restraints would be better in different situations, how those restraints would look, different things. This can help give a clear view of the necessary and unnecessary situations which to administer restraints. Another way this training prepares you is by practicing with others. When practicing with others, they can let you know what you are doing wrong, if you are holding too tight, or just how to implement restraint properly. Practice prepares behavior analysts for restraints. In the practice round, situations can be acted out that the behavior analyst might face on a day-to-day basis or with specific clients. If a client is having a problem behaviors warning the need for restraints, those situations can be acted to show how to keep that particular client safe in the restraints that they would use at that time. These trainings need to be updated every 6 months to stay certified and keep up with the current training protocols. To give a better training, CPI could be refreshed sooner than 6 months. This might provide reassurance that the training is still fresh in the behavior analyst's mind.
Another question would be, restraints or seclusion vary from setting to setting. For example, in Indiana, mechanical restraints are not recommended to be used for people in adult services. Is it ethical to use this as a way to address behavior if it is not something that can be used across various settings? What happens if a child has a mechanical restraint in one setting, but then moves to another setting where that type of restraint is not allowed?
So first and foremost, I'd like to state that a decision to use restraint should always follow the law. If it is not legal, then it should not be used, period, end of question. Secondly, in a situation where restraint is only allowed in one setting and not allowed in another, the overall ethicality of the restraint should first be determined. The experienced practitioner will question the safety of the restraint and its efficacy. They'll ask themselves, is there another way to target that the target behavior can be achieved rather than by use of restraint? what's the least restrictive procedure, basically. And above all, adherence to the code of ethics and the safety and well-being of the client is of the utmost importance. If the code can't be followed and the safety and well-being of the client aren't guaranteed, then the restraint should not be used.
Thanks, Chelsea. We have one more question. Do you have any personal experience related to this topic that you would like to share?
So I personally have experience related to the use of restraints. I worked with a client who had severe self-injurious behaviors as well as aggression. The client tried to traffic if given the chance, jump out of windows regardless of the height, climb onto any elevated surface and try to jump off onto their neck, hit head off walls and floors and many more. When the option of SIB was taken away, the client would then engage in aggressive behaviors towards staff and other peers. These included choking, hitting, kicking, biting, and many more. The client had a special team that was small and trained in the implementation of restraints. Only those team members could work with the client, as well as only those team members could implement the restraints. When the use of restraints happened, the team debriefed afterwards. We would talk about how things played out, how things could change better. Dishion was always a must when we use the restraints. It's also a must when any form of restraint is implemented. If someone needs to move, then it needs to be voiced. So if your arm is under a client causing them harm or causing them to feel some type of discomfort, another staff member can voice that and you were able to move your arm and just remedy the uncomfortableness for the client as well as for the other staff members. Communication keeps everyone in the situation safe and accountable to the use of restraints properly. The use of restraints was necessary in this case to keep the client's peers and staff safe.
Thanks, Dee. And with that, that concludes our debate.